Usermaatre-Setepenra. That is the throne name of Ramses II, the Great. Aside from Ramses, that was the other name he was most known by during his lifetime. But if you were to hop off your time machine, walk right up to Ramses II himself, and if you were to say Usermaatre-Setepenra, he would actually not understand what it is that you're saying. So why is that? Hi everyone, I'm an Egyptologist and I answer your ancient Egypt questions. And in the comment on my last big video, the one on the Eye of Horus, someone asked me a question. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't yet, please do check out that video, as it's a very important topic to ancient Egyptian religion, symbolism, and if you love anything ancient Egypt, I'm sure you're going to find it fascinating. Plus, it's a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, and it's my most successful video yet. And please don't forget to like and subscribe if you want me to make more content like this. So, someone in the comments asked me a question about an Egyptian word I pronounced. And when I say Egyptian, I'm referring to the language of the ancient Egyptians. The language spoken in Egypt today is the Egyptian dialect of Arabic. You see, while Egyptian and Arabic are related, they're only very distantly related to each other. Arabic and Egyptian are both under the large family of Afro-Asiatic languages, but Arabic is a sub-branch of Semitic, which falls under Afro-Asiatic. As for Egyptian, well, it's just Egyptian. Egyptian is its own branch under the large family of Afro-Asiatic languages. So, this Egyptian word that I was asked about was actually what the ancient Egyptians called their god Horus. Hérou, meaning the distant one. And how it sounds so strangely similar to the Armenian word meaning distant or far, hérou. Oh, and incidentally, just as Egyptian is its own branch under Afro-Asiatic languages, so is Armenian its own branch under the large family of Indo-European languages. Yeah, that's right. In addition to history, ancient history, and mythology, I also love languages and linguistics. So, as you all know, Egyptian is a dead language and has been for centuries. Its latest phase, called Coptic, lasted until the 14th century AD. Also, it remains in use until today as the liturgical language of the Coptic Church, Egypt's Christian church. So, if there's no one around actually speaking the language today, how do Egyptologists pronounce the words of a language that's been dead for a very long time? Well, what about Coptic, you might ask? Isn't it still being used in Coptic Mass today, like you just said? Well, that is an excellent question. Assuming that the Coptic language hasn't changed in 500 to 600 years, that is to say, since the 14th century AD, we should still bear in mind that when we're talking about the ancient Egyptians, we're actually talking about several thousands, not hundreds, thousands of years before that. You see, languages change over time. And let's not forget that, ancient Egypt isn't a single time period. When we're talking about ancient Egypt, we're talking about over 3,000 years of history. So, let's put that into perspective. Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, actually Cleopatra VII, she died in around 30 BC. That is to say around 2,000 years ago. Now, the Great Pyramid in Giza, the last surviving member of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the tomb of King Khufu. This king, he finished building this pyramid in around 2550 BC. So, to Cleopatra, the Great Pyramid in Giza was 2,500 years old. Compared to us today, 2,500 years ago was the year 523 BC. So, what that means is, Cleopatra lives closer to us today than when she did to when the pyramid in Giza, the tomb of King Khufu, was built. And not by a few decades, mind you, by half a millennium, by 500 years. So, to get back to Coptic, since it's the language used still today in Egypt as the liturgical language of the Coptic Church, to find out what Egyptian before that sounded like, shouldn't it be a simple matter of attending Coptic Mass? Well, no, because then you're assuming that Coptic hasn't changed in the 500 to 600 years between today and since it was last attested as a living language, around, let's say, 1300 AD. And plus, let's not forget that Ramses II was alive in around 1200 BC. So as you can imagine, the Egyptian language must have changed a lot in the 2,500 years separating Ramses II and 1300 AD. Not only that, but I should also point out that Coptic Mass is conducted in Bohairic Coptic, that is to say, the dialect of Coptic that's associated with the north of the country. You also have Sahidic, associated with the south, and also less widespread ones like, say, Akhmimic, around the city of Akhmim, and so on. So yeah, not only do languages change over time, but they also change over space too. There are different dialects in different places. So yeah, a single language spoken in two different places can exhibit many differences in pronunciation. I mean, just look at how many dialects of English there are in the British Isles alone. So I hope this is beginning to give you an appreciation of the magnitude of the problems that come with trying to reconstruct the language of the ancient Egyptians as it was spoken in very ancient times. So when you ask what the language of the ancient Egyptians sounded like, you should also be asking when exactly. And also where? In Memphis in the north of the country? Or Luxor in the south? Or in Aswan even farther south? The reconstruction of the Egyptian language as spoken during the time of, say, Ramses II in the 1200s BC is further complicated by something else. You see, the scripts used to write the Egyptian language at the time, most notably Egyptian hieroglyphs, did not write down vowels. So you're telling me that we are now facing this monumental task of reconstructing the pronunciation of a very ancient language that no one's spoken in a very long time, and we're doing that with a script that didn't write down vowels? And yeah, that does mean that most of what you're looking at is consonants. And yes, that does mean that most of what you're looking at represent sounds, not directly meaning. They're not logographic. So what that means is when you see an arm or a bird in a given text, it doesn't mean that the text is talking about something involving arms or birds. Most of what you're seeing represent sounds. Let's look at an example. This here is the word meaning to say. The first hieroglyph, the snake, stands for the sound j, and the hand stands for the sound d. As you can see, what we have here is the consonantal skeleton of the word. There was naturally a vowel between these two consonants, but it was simply not written. Now, a native speaker would have had no trouble reading this word, whether it was infinitive, in the present tense, past tense, or imperative, and so on. But since this is now a dead language, we simply don't know what the vowel is and how the pronunciation would have changed depending on the tense of the verb. So, for the sake of this word to be pronounceable, I mean, you can't say ch, right? We Egyptologists have come up with the standard, neutral, filler sound e that'll go in between the consonants. So when you ask an Egyptologist what the ancient Egyptian word for to say was, they'll tell you jed. But that doesn't necessarily tell us about how the word was actually pronounced by the ancient Egyptians way back when. Now you might think that it's a little weird that the ancient Egyptians didn't write down vowels. I mean, why wouldn't they? Well, the thing is, the writing down of vowels is actually a relatively recent phenomenon, appearing only with the Greeks in the 700s BC. Well, without vowels, didn't that make it hard for the ancient Egyptians to read out a given text? Well, No, because if you know Arabic, you'll know that this is not a problem whatsoever. Arabic, like Egyptian, did not write down vowels. Well, sort of. Let me explain. You see, Arabic has essentially 3 vowels. The most straightforward one is the alif, A. But then you also have the y, which is, like the y in English, a glide, a semi-vowel. So what that means is it can be pronounced like an E, like in the word any, but it can also be pronounced kind of like a consonant, like a Y, as in the word yes. Similarly, there's also the letter wo, which, like the W in English, is pronounced like a W, like, you know, as in window. But it could also be alternatively pronounced like a vowel, so U. But in Arabic, you don't write down these vowels, semi-vowels, every time they're pronounced. You see, you only do that when, to put it really simply, it is an extended vowel sound or if it forms a part of the root of the word. And guess what? Egyptian was much the same way. Like Arabic, its vowel sounds were a, u, i, and they were generally not always written down unless due to certain grammatical rules or if they formed a part of the root of the word. As a side note, I want to add that even if we did have the vowels written down, it still wouldn't have been very straightforward to reconstruct the pronunciation of the Egyptian language. You see, if in a hypothetical scenario, English were a dead language, and if you knew somehow that, or if you assumed somehow that, like German, the letter I was pronounced E and the letter T was pronounced T, well, by that logic, if you came across, let's say, the word definition, you would have read that out as definition. How would it have possibly occurred to you that the letter T was supposed to be pronounced like a sh? Back to Egyptian. Okay, so when these extended vowel sounds were written down, they helped the ancient Egyptians with the reading. But what about the rest of the time when they weren't? Well, it might be difficult to imagine if this is not something the language you grew up with already does, but for an Arabic speaker, this is not a problem. You just know how to read out the words, how to pronounce them as you're reading. Let's take the Arabic word madrasa, for example, madrasa. Those among you who are more geekily inclined, like myself, will know that word through, let's say, the amazing franchise of games called Civilization, in which, if you were to play as Arabia, the unique building you can construct is the madrasa. Basically, the word means a place of learning. The root is darasa, which means to study. Today, it's the standard word for just school. Makes sense. But in, let's say, the Middle Ages, or rather in medieval times, I should say, what that word meant was something more akin to what we would today call a university. Okay, so now let's look at this rendered into the Latin alphabet. And here we are, madrasa. Now let's remove the vowels, except there's actually an additional consonant that comes after the S sound in Arabic, actually a T. But it's not pronounced. So once again, it's not just the vowels or lack of them that's a problem, but also the consonants, when they are written down, they're not always pronounced the same way that you would expect, like we saw with the word definition. So now let's look at the Arabic and the English letters and the correlation. So there we are. Madrasa, actually the consonants M-D-R-S-T, but the T isn't pronounced. Arabic has, to facilitate the pronunciation, especially for people learning it, but it plays a especially prominent role also in calligraphy, a tashkil, little symbols that go above and below letters to help facilitate the pronunciation. So in the case of madrasa, they are the diagonal lines on 3 of the letters indicate the sound a. Now imagine if Arabic had no tashkil and that there hasn't been anyone speaking Arabic for thousands of years. Well, That's actually the exact same situation that we have with the Egyptian language. Okay, so let's look at another Egyptian word as an example. This is the word meaning words, medu. The first three hieroglyphs represent sounds. And remember, the A sound that I inserted, that's just the sound that I inserted, the standard one adopted by Egyptologists. So we have only M, D, U. What about that last sign then? Well, that sign is why I specified earlier that most hieroglyphs represent sounds. This last one is what we Egyptologists call a determinative. It has no phonetic value, meaning that it is not to be pronounced, and what it does is it categorizes the word. So, the determinative of the man pointing to his mouth is used for words having to do with speaking, yelling, eating, drinking, and so on. Pretty cool, right? So anyway, we Egyptologists pronounce this word as medu, and in the plural something like medu, when in reality the ancient Egyptians would have actually pronounced this word as madu, at least before the New Kingdom. Similarly, the word hetep, which appears very often and used in famous names like Amenhotep and Imhotep, well, as an adjective meaning pleasing, we know that it was actually pronounced something like hatip. So, let's rewind and come back to the Armenian word héru, meaning distant or far, that I brought up at the very start of this video. I pronounced the name of the ancient Egyptian god, the ancient Egyptian version of the name of the god Horus, as héru. But the thing is, now you know that the A sound there between the H and the R is actually merely the filler sound used by Egyptologists in between consonants. Not only that, but I should also add that the R is actually supposed to be rolled, so it's a R. And the H sound there is not a H, but a H. So it's like the Arabic letter Ha. So how was this word pronounced then? Well, now you know better, because now it's not just a question of how was it pronounced, you should also be specifying when, right? Because languages change over time. So, earlier in Egyptian history, we know that it was pronounced something like haru. However, after the reign of Ramses II, we know that it was actually pronounced something like hor. So as you can see, the Armenian word héru only sounds similar to héru, which is the way we today in modern times pronounce Egyptian words, not to how the word was actually pronounced in ancient Egyptian times by the ancient Egyptians themselves, whether haru or hor, héru. Very different. Let's come full circle and talk about the throne name of Ramses II. Usermaatre-Setepenra. One proposed translation is powerful of the justice of Ra, the chosen of Ra. And the main name part of this name, the foundational part, Usermaatre, we know that in texts composed in the Babylonian language, written in the cuneiform script, so the Babylonian language was spoken in what is today Iraq. And we know that in these texts, it was rendered as Wa'ashmuaria. And in Egypt itself, at the time of Ramses II, we think that it was pronounced something like Wasi'mu'ariya. Userma'atra, Wa'ashmuaria, Userma'atra, Wasi'mu'ariya. Very different. Similarly, the epithet part of the name, Setepenra, the chosen of Ra. In Babylonian texts, it was rendered as Shatepnaria. And in Egyptian, we think it was pronounced something like Satepnaria. Usermaatre-Setepenra, Wasi'mu'ariya-Satepnaria. Completely different. So when you hopped out of your time machine, walked right up to Ramses II and proudly said, Usermaatre-Setepenra, well, no wonder he didn't understand what you were saying. Because what you should have actually said was, Usermaatre-Setepenra. Well, that was a long ride now, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed this video just as much as I enjoyed doing the research for it. Let me know in the comments down below what you want me to talk about next. And now, before finishing this video, I want to extend my sincerest thanks to my dear friend Marwan, who is an absolute expert in Egyptian phonology. He and I talk about languages for hours, totally nerding out together. And thank you, Marwan, for helping me with sources that I used in the research for this video. And also, Marwan, by the way, is the one who told me about how he thinks the name of Ramses II, the throne name of Ramses II, was actually pronounced in his lifetime. And also, if you're interested in this kind of thing, Marwan's also done something else that's very, very interesting. The link is down below. It's a YouTube video, and in it, Marwan actually reconstructed the pronunciation of an entire section of an actual ancient Egyptian story that Egyptologists today call the Report of Wenamun. Do check it out, and when you do, you might recognize the voice of the reader.